presented, which involves several persons here. Partly Ulf was part of this project. And this involves partly the results from the Refisk project, which is a project we've heard from several other presentations by Örjan present part of that work, and also Stefan and Lovisa a bit this morning about the genetics. So I wouldn't necessarily call myself a fish ecologist or a fisheries ecologist. I'm more of a sort of ecosystem ecologist. I will start not with talking about pike, but about no-take marine protected areas. And as I think most of you are aware, MPAs have become a sort of hallmark solution within marine conservation over the last couple of decades, and are often hailed as an ecological success story, where hundreds of studies, if not thousands of studies, shows us that generally no-take areas tend to increase the size, the biomass, and the diversity of target species. This can in turn generate spillover to fished areas, and they support fish stocks, even though the actual benefits from that spillover is quite questionable, I would say, based on the few existing studies. But also in really effective MPAs, we also see that these protection effects can cascade to non-target species, resulting, for example, in stronger predation pressure on lower trophic levels or stronger competition. And those effects can sometimes create knock-on effects all the way down to the basis of the food web in terms of, for example, primary producers or foundation species like corals or kelp and so on. And MPAs have even been suggested to influence or benefit ecosystem resistance and resilience to more sort of diffuse pressures like eutrophication and climate change. But this is also quite heavily disputed, I would say. And generally speaking, we also know that the larger the MPAs are, the older they are, the more isolated they are from human pressures, and the better they tend to work from an ecological perspective. So this has probably contributed to the fact that quite recently, a lot of countries in the world have signed up to increase their national levels of protected areas from what is today between, I would say, 5 and maybe 15, in some cases up to 20%. And that it should be increased up to 30% by 2030, this 30 by 30 rule of thumb, which is a very, very ambitious goal, I would say. However, if you look at the MPAs from the other side of the social ecological system, from the human perspective, quite a lot of social scientists have often, at least particularly in the past, raised a lot of problems with particularly no-take marine protected areas, and sometimes they refer to them as socioeconomic failures, where poorly implemented MPAs and poorly planned MPAs that exclude participation by resource users results in an exclusion of persons, not only from fishing, but also from the actual decision-making process, which tends to overall reduce benefits. This can in turn intensify efforts in fishing outside of MPAs, contributing to stronger effects. It tends to increase conflicts, not only between fishers and managers, but also between different fishing groups and fishing gear groups, for example. This can intensify the ecological effects of fishing, negative effects, but it can also result in that the MPAs are increasingly poached, fished despite no-take rules. Overall, then contributing to the ineffectiveness of some MPAs and the existence of so-called paper parks, for example, MPAs that exist on paper but not in reality. So I think there's an increasing recognition that MPAs in general need to cater more to both nature and society. Particularly over the last decade, we've seen an increase in discussions regarding this, but also an increasing in number of MPAs that actually tend to or try to accommodate to these double needs. But besides these large isolated complete no-take areas, there is a need for alternative MPAs if we're going to meet these 20% by 2030. And here comes one of the suggested types of solutions are temporary closures, which can exist in different types. This can be, for example, closures that are protected long enough for stocks to partially recover, and then they're opened up for fishing again. It could be so-called rotating fishery closures, where part of the entire area is protected, and then that the protected area is moved so that there's always the same proportion of a greater area that is protected, but the actual site is moved between locations over time. And then we have a third type, which is the one we've been studying here, seasonal fishery closures, areas that are then protected during particularly sensitive periods to often, for example, life stages like spawning. There's been a little bit of meta-analytical work done on these types of temporary or partial protected areas. And what we basically see, this is one of the studies, there are some other ones as well, but we tend to see weaker but still significant positive effects of partial protection on target species. Generally speaking, they tend to be more readily accepted among fishers. But one knowledge gap here is that we really don't know what are the effects of these types of partial MPAs on the rest of the ecosystem. And from a Swedish perspective, prior to this study, there were really no studies, and there are quite a few studies that I know of in the Baltic Sea context as well. So if we move to the Baltic Sea, Swedish Baltic Sea context, as we've heard from other speakers previously here, most of the fisheries are recreational along the coast, and pike, perch, and pike perch, and to some extent also sea trout are the main target species, quite considerable worth. We do know also that at the same time as these species have an important economic value, they also have an important ecological value. This is a conceptual model which is based on a structural equation model from a study that we did a couple of years ago in a project called Plantfish, where we used large-scale field surveys across different types of coastal bays to then give support to the fact that abundant and high biomass dense stocks of piscivores, particularly of perch, but also pike, has cascading effects on lower trophic levels, tends to reduce abundances of small predatory fish like stickleback, which in turn benefits important grazers like gammarids, which also seems to have an indirect knock-on effects on, for example, the occurrence of filamentous algae. So all in all, there is support both from these types of studies as well as experiments that healthy piscivore stocks tend to reduce, for example, eutrophication symptoms. But at the same time here, as we've seen from other presentations throughout the week here, we've seen strong declines, particularly among pike populations along the coast. And there are also indications that more and more of the surveyed local perch stocks are starting to show signs of decrease also when it comes to adult stocks. The contribution to of the recreational fisheries to this decline is not really clear, I would say, but this is one of the few existing studies from the Swedish Baltic Sea coast that really suggests that, based on a comparison between one quite long take, full no-take area compared to a bunch of other reference areas, suggested that particularly for perch, there's a negative effect of fishing. So the blue bar here shows the abundance of perch in the no-take area, which is clearly higher than in any of the other areas. The effects on pike here were quite unclear, partly because the method used here, survey net, gill nets, that is not really that effective to catch pike, as we've heard also during the week. And pike perch, a third target species here, appear to be more affected by eutrophication status than fishing. And this is a species that actually benefits from eutrophication and has partly declined along the coast because of improved water clarity. However, what we also know from, particularly if we go back a decade or two, is that there has been a strong resistance to implement long-term and complete no-take areas along the Swedish coastline. This is now changing a little bit, but especially if we look in the early 2000s, there were very, very few of these types of areas. What happened at that time instead was that particularly one individual here, Henrik Andersson, was instrumental to, after long discussions and sort of paving the ground, managed to implement 25 warning season closures in Stockholm archipelago, so-called lekföreningsområden in Swedish. And in 2017, or a bit before that, Henrik managed to acquire some funding to evaluate the effectiveness of these areas. and we decided to team up with this project Refisk in a project that we were running at that time called Plantfish. So together we looked at the effects of these seasonal closures on the target fish species, primarily then pike, but also non-target fish species. And we also sampled some additional variables in these bays to look at impacts on lower trophic levels and the potential for trophic cascades. So the data that I included here includes data from 11 of these pairs of bays, 11 seasonal closures with 11 paired fish areas, which were the nearby bays with similar size, similar wave exposure and depth. There were no standardized data collection done in these areas prior to the collection. So like in a lot of other MPA effect studies, we are required to use a sort of site for time replacement design instead. That's the best we could do with the data set. There are obvious limitations to how far we can extrapolate there and what we can really say about actual effects. But that is the data we have at present. So in each of these bays, we sampled fish communities in this abiotic variable, but we also sampled a number of different covariates that we from past studies know have an influence of these different variables. For example, water temperature is a really important factor influencing the catchability of fish. We know that bay isolation, including both, for example, water retention time, wave exposure, and bay topographic openness, tends to influence a lot of different characteristics in these shallow bay communities. And we also know that the percent of benthic vegetation cover tends to have a strong influence also on particularly some of the species. So the sampling was done in the spring of 2017. In April, all the bays were fished using rod and reel for pike. So this fishing was done by 2-person expert teams on 2-day occasions on 2 separate times. And so one bay was fished for half a day, either in the protected area or in the reference bay. And then they would switch to the second bay by lunchtime, and then this was repeated the next day, and then this whole procedure was repeated one time more during the same month. And all the caught fish were measured, sexed, weighed, and also most of the fish, not all, but most of them were also tagged to control for recaptures. And then about a week after the last of this rod fishing has been done, we went out together with a team of researchers and consultants and sampled the rest of the fish community using Nordic survey nets, 3 to 5 survey nets per bay. This was done on one occasion. We sampled temperature, salinity, and vegetation cover. For the fish here, we focus on 2 species, European perch and 3-spined stickleback. We also sampled zooplankton, which is an important food source, particularly for juvenile fish. And this allows us to look at correlatively, at least, the potential for trophic interactions between these different species. So in short, almost 700 hours of angling, all in all, slightly more than 400 pike catches. So 3/4 of those were enclosures. Only 8 recaptures from this year. The mean size was 65 centimeters, and only one individual was 1 meter. When we fit this data into a generalized linear model, we find that closures generated on average 2 to 4 times higher catch per unit effort, 2 to 6 times higher weight per unit effort in closures, and a similar pattern when we look at larger pike, about 60 centimeters. We saw no effect on the mean length of the caught pike. So this suggests then that closures may increase pike abundance, but we can't rule out that there's also an effect here of actual catchability. So we tried to look a little bit of this just now during this week using part of this data, but also data that has been sampled more recently. So this is very preliminary. So in some of these bays, they have continued to be angling in 2018 to 2021 in the spring. So we looked at the number of recaptures per bay and year in 14 of the bays as a function of the number of tagged fish in any year and the status, whether it was protected or fished during this time of year, and then controlling for site and year to year variability. And what is, again, I emphasize, very preliminary results suggest that even when we control for how many fish were actually tagged that year, we still find a positive influence of closures on the number of recaptured fish. So this indicates, I'm saying this is very preliminary, and these are analyses that we're going to continue with, but they suggest that recaptures are more likely in fish diets, even when we control for how many fish we actually catch. This could potentially indicate that protected pike are more easily captured. Are they less stressed, more hungry? There may be an influence here of also body size, sex, food availability, body condition, and these are things that we'll continue looking at. If we go look at the rest of the community here, we find, if we look at perch, we find no closure effect at all, a positive effect of temperature and bay isolation, similar to what we found in other studies. Look at three-spine stickleback, a species that has increased dramatically along the Swedish coastline over the last couple of decades. We find, again, no effect of closures, negative effect of temperature actually, and negative effect of perch catch per unit effort. So indicative here of the top-down control of abundant perch stocks. And if we look at zooplankton, we find no effect of closures, a positive effect of temperature, and a negative effect of stickleback catch per unit effort. So these results are indicative of a trophic cascade from perch to zooplankton, similar to what has been found in past studies, but it doesn't seem to be involving pike. So all in all, what do these results suggest? Well, first of all, I think they suggest that these seasonal closures may benefit these coastal pike populations and help them cling on despite their own sort of coast-wide decline, but we can't yet say to what extent that is caused by actual benefits on the number of pike and to what extent the catchability of individual pike plays in here. Generally speaking, we know that perch biomass on average is 45 times higher than pike biomass in a lot of the coastal bays, and this suggests, together with results, suggest that perch is the more functionally important piscivore in these areas. And has the ability to, in this data set, contribute to what seems to be a trophic cascade, similar to what we found in other areas, and that trophic cascade doesn't seem to be influenced by pike. That doesn't rule out that more abundant pike stocks in the past contributed to such cascading effects, but at least they don't seem to be doing that at present. So all in all, I think these results suggest that seasonal closures probably have a contribution to make in coastal management. But if we want to have stronger effects of closures, we probably need to have more permanent and potentially even larger closures. And especially from a research perspective, I think these closures are really, really important as baselines to understand what is happening to these ecosystems with and without impacts from fishing. With that, I say thank you, and I'm ready to take questions.